Hey everyone, it's the Koopa Man. We've been talking about storytelling and tropes for the past couple of videos, and now that Summer Game Fest is come and gone, it's got me thinking. Well, no, this is another video recommended by one of you, the viewers, in the Koopa Troop. Ren Kawazawa, otherwise known as the Divine Dragon, has recommended this topic to me. And that topic is story that important in video games, even at the detriment of gameplay? Well, to answer this question, we need to ask this one instead. What separates video games from movies? As well as most other forms of media, but mostly movies for the sake of argument. Well, the answer is gameplay, obviously, but it's far more than that. Games give the person playing the game a level of control that other forms of media cannot replicate. Even the most simplistic ones like Pong or Pac-Man can do things movies cannot, give the audience a means of controlling what happens. Interactivity is what divides video games from books, comics, movies, TV shows, and the like. Even as games became more advanced and became methods of telling stories, the interactive elements were still core to what they were. The primary focus was first and always to give the player an experience they can fully control to their heart's content, rather than to dictate to them what was going on and what they were supposed to do. That isn't to say there was always complete freedom. I mean, The Legend of Zelda is a good example of this. The only two games where story wasn't all that important were the two NES titles, and since then they've been more focusing on developing the world, lore, story, and setting of Hyrule. Take Ocarina of Time, for example. You are able to control the character Link and do whatever you want with him for sure, but it always ends with the defeat of Ganon. There is no version of the story where Ganondorf wins and Hyrule is doomed. At least there wasn't until Nintendo decided to be pants-on-head retarded about everything. But you get what I mean. Though nowadays, it seems like a lot of games, particularly ones developed or published over at the House of the Salty Pony, are taking away gameplay elements and player agency in order to focus more on the story they're trying to tell. Even more, the stories they're telling really aren't that good to begin with, but that's a whole different kettle of fish. More and more games in the current age are focusing less on the gameplay or even making fun games to begin with, and more on pushing their stories. Examples of this being The Last of Us, the latest two God of War titles, anything that David Cage has put his hand on. Notice a number of these are Sony branded. Anyway, Uncharted 4, Death Stranding, Until Dawn, Life is Strange, Gone Home, even The Order 1886. I am also remiss to add Telltale Games titles to this list, as the few I've played are more like the point-and-click adventure games of old rather than walking simulators, but there are some who would consider them that as well. I cannot stress this enough though. While a number of these games are Sony developed or published, this is not Sony's fault. Entirely. No, what caused this was a number of so-called game developers in the modern era seeing video games as a platform to supposedly bigger and better things, specifically Hollywood. They used the gaming industry and its consumers as a springboard into their supposed rightful place among the stars, only to forget that Hollywood will never take video games seriously as an art form, and also that if they had actual talent, they'd already be among the stars. Also, the reason why someone would want to be amongst an elite cabal of pedophiles is beyond me, but whatever. As such, the games that these supposed developers produced look just like that. Movies. Interactive movies, but movies nonetheless. David Cage really wishes he was a Hollywood director riding around in the Lolita Express with Jeffrey Epstein. That isn't to say there's anything wrong with this. I mean, I liked Detroit Become Human. When it was called Blade Runner, it wasn't trying to push a Black Lives Matter narrative and make a bunch of fat women rich with money to buy mansions and luxury cars. Yeah, you thought the organization was there to help black people? Turns out some black people, specifically the women at the very top of the group, were more equal than others. But seriously, some games do manage to tell really good and powerful stories without sacrificing gameplay. Many people would cite games like The Witcher 3, which made The Witcher a mainstream franchise instead of Elric of Melanated Boner, written by a man who hated J.R.R. Tolkien and tried to cancel his fellow authors, as an example of a game that had great gameplay and an even greater story. Other examples include Final Fantasy, particularly numbers 1, 4, 6, and 7, the Nier series, particularly Nier Automata, Kingdom Hearts, Chrono Trigger, Portal 2, BioShock, System Shock, Red Dead Redemption, and countless others. In fact, the RPG games I listed are especially notable as the RPG genre is focused on telling stories. It's just that those ones are ones that stand out even amongst the entire genre. Even games like Kirby and Sonic the Hedgehog, games you'd think were simple fare, have deep and elegant tapestries of lore. So much so that Kirby lore is an actual meme in and of itself.
You want to talk about stress? Want to talk about stress? okay? I've stumbled onto a major company conspiracy, Mac. How about that for stress? What the hell are you talking about? This company is being bled like a stuffed pig, Mac, and I got a paper trail to prove it. Check this out. Take a look at this.
Jesus Christ,
That
Charlie.
right there is the mail. Now let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail, please, Mac? I'm dying to talk about the mail with you all day, okay? Pepe Sylvia. This name keeps coming up over and over again. Every day, Pepe's mail's getting sent back to me. Pepe Sylvia, Pepe Sylvia. I look in the mail. Well, this whole box is Pepe Sylvia. So I say to myself, I gotta find this guy. I gotta go up to his office. I gotta put his mail in the guy's goddamn hands. Otherwise, he's never gonna get it. It's gonna keep coming back down here. So I go up to Pepe's office, and what do I find out, Mac? What do I find out? There is no Pepe Sylvia. The man does not exist, okay? So I decided, oh, shit, buddy, I gotta dig a little deeper. There's no Pepe Sylvia. You gotta be kidding me. I got boxes full of Pepe. All right, so I start marching my way down to Carol in HR, and I knock on her door, and I say, Carol! Carol, I gotta talk to you about Pepe. And when I open the door, what do I find? There's not a single goddamn desk in that office. There is no Carol in HR. Matt, half the employees in this building have been made up. This office is a goddamn ghost town.
Speaking of Sonic, though, this isn't a problem that just goes one way. There is a group of people, albeit a much smaller one, who will go out of their way to say that story in video games isn't as important as gameplay. Examples of this being YouTubers like AntDude and Egoraptor, otherwise known as Darth Aaron the Egotistical. While there was a time where story wasn't that important in games, around the time of Pong and Pac-Man actually, this really isn't the case anymore. There are times where focusing too much on the player experience or non-linearity will get in the way of the narrative the game may be trying to tell. Examples of this being, well, Breath of the Wild and its sequel, and no, I am not sorry for saying that, but also Pokemon Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, where the changes to the mechanics and the flow of the game fundamentally changed how the narrative was unfolded. The Sonic meta era, specifically the games from Colors to Forces, which focused more on the boost gameplay and put story on the backseat for the sake of appeasing commentators like the two I listed. The later entries in the Paper Mario RPG series, which had Bowser reduced to a non-speaking dragon-like threat like he is in the main series and barely had any story for an RPG, and Street Fighter VI, which, like the vanilla version of 5, put story content in a backseat to the gameplay. Granted, it did have a single-player mode, but said mode was a blatant rip-off of the created character story from Dragon Ball Xenoverse. So obviously, gameplay and story are both important in video games. While story isn't essential to all video games, most games these days have it as a requirement. Though there are still very popular games that have no story whatsoever, Among Us being the prime example. Still, it's a matter of finding the right balance, and that balance is heavily dependent on the kind of game that's being played. An adventure game like Legend of Zelda could give you the freedom to go wherever you want, but adventures are very story-driven, so if you rush off to fight Calamity Ganon, you pretty much miss the entire game. This wasn't an issue with Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, or Twilight Princess, because while those games had wider open worlds with each passing installment, they also had a structured story that followed a set order. Role-playing games live and die on their stories, so to have an RPG that barely has any story, like the Paper Mario Sticker Star trilogy, it stands out as something that isn't very good. Fighting games and shooter games tend to focus more on their multiplayer aspects, especially now in the age of competitive esports. That isn't to say that these games shouldn't have a story. Some of the best fighting and shooter games are very lore heavy, like Halo or King of Fighters. And sometimes two games of the same genre will have varying levels of story or gameplay focus. Super Mario's main series is far more about player control, and thus the story is usually more simplistic. Bowser kidnaps Peach again, go save her. Sonic, on the other hand, found a balance between gameplay and storytelling, even back on the Sega Genesis, that allows it to put forth a narrative in each game and tell an interesting story beyond go stop Eggman. That isn't to say that stopping Eggman isn't a focus, but there's way more to it than that. In the end though, gameplay and story in video games are both important. Not always to an equal degree, but that balance needs to be just perfect for each game, otherwise they'll end up being a detriment to one side or the other. And when that happens, it just makes for a really bad game. Anyway, that's all for this topic. What games do you think focus too much on story over gameplay, or even gameplay over story? Talk about them in the comments. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe as it helps me with the algorithm. And until next time, this has been the Koopa Man. Game on.